Hello and welcome to the CFB edition of the Super Show. I'm your host, Walter Waddell, joined by my friend Jay Kuchek. We're going to be talking about the Week 10 action, but beforehand, we need to do a little bit of housekeeping and talk about some fun stuff happening. Obviously, the college basketball season is about to start on Monday. There is a promo code happening if you use it. Scrolling on the bottom there, Night Hoops. NIGHTHOOPS gets you 50% off. I got to get it on there. 50% off your first month of any subscription. That is an incredible value. I'm very excited to be able to release that to you guys here. Brand new code just in effect today. Get on it. FTN Bets, FTN Daily, whatever sub you want to do, that is the code to use for that additional discount. Check us out. See what we're all about, especially after a great last week in which 1% owned Audric Estime had 3 touchdowns, and then your guy from Cal, Mendoza, had a fantastic game as well. Jake, welcome to the show. Thanks a lot for joining me as always. We're riding high after a great Saturday, and I'm feeling pretty damn good about the slate coming up here in Week 10. A few more weeks before bowl season, if you can believe it, and we're starting to dial in, which is a great feeling.
Yeah, man. Pretty exciting momentum to be riding in off of. I was pretty high on that Cal USC game, and it was one of those games where, you know, if you stack it up, you have a good chance to win all the money or lose all the money. There wasn't going to be much in between with that one, and luckily that one went our way and made up for a little bit too much Justin Johnson exposure, but you know, we did pretty well with the Mendoza call and Marshawn Lloyd on the other side, kind of breaking free for some things, and obviously Caleb having a pretty decent game too all the way around. It was a pretty juicy fantasy affair.
Yeah, definitely. And we slide into Week 10. We had some action slates this week, a couple of other games today that we're just kind of, you know, doing our thing, but we're really diving in here for this main slate. And we're going to do our thing with the game by game. Also going to do a little bit of prize picks, some prop betting opportunities, and then I'm going to touch on FanDuel player pool like I did last week. So with that being said, we're going to dive right in. If you guys are watching live, thank you. Feel free to interact. Make sure you smash that like button. Ask your questions if you got them. Jake's going to start us off with Arkansas versus Florida, a total of 50, and Florida as a 4.5-point favorite. Let's get started, my friend.
Yeah, so interesting spot. You know, coming right out of the gate here. The last time we saw Arkansas, they, you know, that was the game that I was thinking KJ Jefferson was gonna blow up, and it was just a whole bunch of nobody doing nothing. They lost to Mississippi State 7-3. Like, that's not a first quarter score or a second quarter score. That was the whole game, 7-3. And I mean, that's even Iowa and service academies, like they get a total in the 20s, high 20s, low 30s. Nobody has a total of 10 as a projection. That was just a ridiculous game. I think we're going to see a pretty different version of Arkansas here. You know, obviously we're well into conference play. They should come out, you know, off a bye week, fairly healthy. Florida just had their biggest game of the season against Georgia and got trampled. And so these teams could not be coming in to this game more differently in terms of where their psyches are at. I mean, Arkansas has been licking their wounds, getting healthy. Hopefully we get Rocket Sanders back for this one. And that certainly changes the dynamic of the Arkansas offense if we're able to get him involved. And, you know, we'll start with him, because if Rocket Sanders is playing and is a full go at 4.9, I don't know how we don't play him. Like that's just way too low of a price for what we know he can do. And he's never going to be a volume back, especially not coming off of an injury. He's not going to get 25 carries or anything, but we've seen other SEC backs go bonkers on this Florida D line, and just about every week. Even with last week with Edwards going off. And obviously we've seen Ray Davis do pretty well in the past, but if we get 15 to 18 touches from Rocket at 4.9, that's a super compelling, super interesting price. We can think about KJ at 6.6 too. It's this Arkansas side, I feel like people are going to go, oh, well, Arkansas was just terrible their last time out. Look at the box scores, look at the game log, and, how can we trust this Arkansas offense? I think it's going to be a very different offense, and a lot more cohesive, a lot more compelling, and, they're going to be able to move the ball against Florida better than they were against just about everybody else. So, if we're using Jefferson, obviously Andrew Armstrong is their kind of steady Eddie. We've seen some Isaac Tesla. We've seen some Ty Washington get involved. One spike game from him, not a ton. Waiting for my man Isaiah Satania to really break out. He flashed a little bit and then kind of went back to being a dud. But definitely some cheap options on the Arkansas side. At every position. So feel free to get exposure to that offense. I mean, you're not jamming them in. I don't think this needs to be a super game stack scenario, but I do think that there will be a compelling case to see the Arkansas offense do some things and put up some fireworks. On the Florida side, not using Graham Mertz ever. Don't think that that's going to change this week. If he burns me, so be it. But if he were in the 5s or something, I might consider it. But because we have seen him do pretty well, especially in South Carolina. It was a phenomenal game out of him. But at 7,200, it's probably too rich for my blood for a quarterback of his quality. I do think that they're going to have their way kind of running the ball. Montrell Johnson is more or less the lead back, although we always are going to split carries with Trevor Etienne. So one of those two, you get a decent discount on ETN, but he's still 5.3. It's not like he's down there in the 4s or anything. But either of those two are certainly capable of having a good day. And that's kind of going to be the focal point of the offense. Other than, Ricky Pearsall has been as consistent as you can be with Graham Mertz throwing you the ball. And, even against Georgia, going 6 for basically 100, it's pretty impressive against a pretty tough defense, and we've seen him put up a lot more volume than that. So pretty expensive at the $7,100 price tag, not forcing Pearsall. Super interested in what's been happening with Eugene Wilson, Trey Wilson, some people like to call him. Just tons of volume, more underneath stuff. We're not going to see 80-yard touchdowns most likely from him, but he's been extremely involved in the offense in the passing game. And if we could get him breaking a tackle or two in open space, I'm probably more interested in him at 53 than I am in Pearsall at 71, just because I want to get kind of some value pieces from this game. We've seen Boardingham do some things too. Not as interested there, but at 4,400, obviously if you want exposure to this Florida offense, which I think you should, that is a place to go if you want to save some extra dollars. So either of the running backs and then one of Pearsall, Wilson, or Boardingham in the receiver room, and then probably just Armstrong as the main focal point in Arkansas in the receiving room. So definitely pieces to get to from this game. Not forcing the game stack, but I could see it as a viable option.
Yeah, and Eugene Wilson is definitely my favorite play as well. Going right in the main lineup, most likely at 5.3, 12 targets last week against the Georgia team. Scored twice in the last 3 weeks. The true freshman looks like he's going to be a big-time star, so I am in agreement with that one as well. All right, moving on to the next game, we have Notre Dame versus Clemson, a 44 total. Notre Dame comes in as 3-point favorites. It sure was a nice feeling having Audric at 1%, but it was a panic for me because he had yardage, but he wasn't scoring. And then he had a second half of just like, hey, we're just going to keep punching it in, even though we're blowing these guys out. So he had 3 touchdowns in the second half, which I was certainly happy with. sitting there at 7-1, we can expect him to be very low owned again. Obviously, a much tougher defense in Clemson, which is a group giving up less than 100 yards per game on the ground and less than 270 yards of total offense. Notre Dame's defense also very strong, so we're not really looking to go with the quarterbacks here, of course, but we do have some injury situations. The top receiver, actually the tight end, but he is the top pass catcher, in Mitchell Evans, is going to miss the rest of the season after tearing an ACL. Does open up some potential for a guy like Holden Stays, who now becomes the tight end one. He does have 4 touchdowns in that offense. There's some other pass catchers here that are very cheap on the Notre Dame side, but it's been very difficult to peg. They've been very spread out and inconsistent. This just isn't the same offense that we're accustomed to seeing Sam Hartman operate like it was at Wake Forest. So it's really just estimate or nothing. On the Clemson side, we do have a day-to-day injury after the concussion protocol for Will Shipley. So theoretically, there's film off of there, but he's 5'5", so we're not getting the huge discount. And again, I'm not in the habit of targeting people against this Notre Dame defense. It's just been so good. So maybe some people will be looking there because if Shipley misses, there's usage available, but just not really my thing. I do want to say that it brings me a lot of joy that Jake Brenningstill is crushing it lately. He's we always joke that it's our showdown special. Hasn't been too many Clemson showdowns lately, but Brenningstill 5 catches for 126 yards, 2 touchdowns against Miami. That was on 10 targets, and then he followed that up with another 10 targets, 8 catches, 93 yards against NC State. So Brenningstill definitely on the rise, only 4-4. I do think if there is a spot that could maybe get off against this Notre Dame defense, it is the tight end because of those short throws. And he's just a really reliable target right now for this Clemson offense. So Brenningstill at 4-4 is an interesting option. We don't have to take these kind of outside shots at our lineup this week. We have 2 really solid values that are mispriced, broken, whatever you want to say. So we don't have to take these shots unless we're playing some large field GPPs or alt lineups. In our mains, we don't have to take a guy like Brenningstill this week, although he is kind of a fun option for tournaments for that purpose. But otherwise, this is a game that I won't be too heavily on, but I'm certainly interested in from a competitive standpoint. This Notre Dame team has just been really good. Interested to see if we who steps up with Evans out, but other than that, I will be moving forward. Do you have anything to add there, or should we keep it going?
I think we keep it rolling.
All right. Ohio State versus Rutgers is next. The total of 42.5. 19-point favorites are the Buckeyes. No mistake. No for me to not give you an Ohio State game. You've been great about breaking them down, and they finally are in a matchup where maybe we can take advantage of them. High prices as usual. But where are we going with this group?
And I'd like to add number 1 CFP ranked Ohio State, the Ohio State University.
Yeah.
Don't quite know how that happened, but there's some turmoil in Michigan, so maybe that played a part. First thing, our obligatory Kyle McCord's just not it. So we can skip right over him. It's 7,600. Very much into TreVeyon Henderson at 65. We finally got the game that I wanted to have 3 or 4 weeks ago when we were loading up on TreVeyon Henderson at like 7-1 or whatever price he was at, and then we got news day of that he was not going to be able to play, and loaded up on Chip, trade him instead, and then he got hurt and Dallin Hayden took like 16 carries or something. So finally got the TreVeyon Henderson game, 24 carries for 162 yards and a touchdown to go with 4 receptions for 45 yards. Like, that is the quintessential TreVeyon Henderson game. Tons of volume, tons of efficiency, involvement in the passing game, getting into the end zone. Like, that's what this kid can do. And yes, Rutgers has been difficult against the run, but we're still talking about Rutgers against Ohio State. Like, there are going to be holes. He is explosive enough to take advantage of those holes. Rutgers offense is not going to do anything against this Ohio State defense. And Ohio State's going to just have the ball a lot. So if there's anything to be concerned about, it's blowout territory. But honestly, TreVeyon hasn't played enough. They need to get him lathered up and going and get him some volume. And so I'm not even overly concerned about the blowout narrative. I think he would still play well into, late in the third quarter, even if they are up by 3 scores or even more than that. So very much into that. To Harrison or not to Harrison. If you're not playing Anderson, you should be playing Harrison. At 8,900, if you think that it's not going to happen via the run game, Harrison's the only guy that McCord really throws to and has any success with. Like we've had a less than healthy Egbuka for most of the season, so they haven't really had a chance to develop chemistry. We saw a lot of Cade Stover in a few matchups, and he generally will find the end zone a time or two, or he'll bagel like he did against Wisconsin. And so can't really rely too much on Cade Stover, even at that $4,600 price tag. And then even less reliable has been Julian Fleming, which, probably one of the biggest disappointments out of an Ohio State wide receiver career. He's never really had a chance to break out and do his thing. And, then you've got your younger guys in Ennis and Carnell Tate that probably are going to see some fourth quarter run after this one is well in hand, but I don't think our guys that we're looking to deploy in a otherwise fully healthy wide receiver room. So it's really just Henderson or Harrison. I'm probably not trying to force a GPP Egbuka in there or Fleming or Stover. So pick your poison. Are they going to get things done on the ground, or are they going to get things done through the air? I'm going to lean with both the massive discount, 6,500 versus 8,900, and Ohio State's tendency to want to kind of pound the rock on the ground when able to, and I think they'll be able to. So I that's the Ohio State side. I don't really have a run back on the Rutgers side. I'd be, we're kidding ourselves if we think that there's going to be successful offense. And what is their implied point total? Probably like 13 points or something like that. So probably just going to stick with one of our two Ohio State options on this one.
Yes, sir. Henderson looks definitely juicy here. It's going to be hard for me to get to Harrison, but Jesus, he's like every week, it's like, damn, it'd be nice to have those 30 points, but the opportunity cost there is tough. But nobody's going to roster him. So it's nice to have those 30 points in your bag with, sub 5% every week. All right, moving right along here to the next game, which is going to be Kansas State versus Texas. We have a 49.5 total. Texas are your favorites. This is a tough one for me because I usually like to be on Kansas State games, but their defense is just, ridiculously strong right now. They held a coming into a hot TCU team to 3 points, and then they blanked Houston a week later. Really difficult, but obviously Texas is a different animal than both of those teams. But it's certainly not a situation where I'm feeling too excited about targeting anyone. We're not getting huge discounts on the Texas side for anyone relevant at this point. Jonathan Brooks is almost 8K. The BYU game was, he's at a price now where when he puts up 23, it's nice, but that's still kind of a letdown. They blew the doors off BYU and he just didn't get the workload that we were expecting. He still got his receptions, especially with Murphy at quarterback there. That was something that we kind of thought would happen, and it did. Still a fine option, but I think that there are other guys we can utilize this week for around, the same price or even a little cheaper. And I think that means Brooks is going to be the lowest owned that he's been in the last, 3, 4, 5 weeks even, which is interesting for tournaments because he still very well could throw up 40 on Kansas State. He's obviously that good. I just don't know that he will. Xavier Worthy, your guy there at almost 7K. That's tough for me, but obviously a game breaker waiting to happen. Even when he's only catching 4 passes, he's still putting up a pretty solid total. He had a return touchdown, I believe it was, last week as well. So don't hate that as a play. On the Kansas State side, they're still running the 2 quarterback thing. They're going to continue to give Avery Johnson work. He's a fun quarterback to look out for GPPs, not here against Texas. He had that massive game against Texas Tech, and you're seeing, it's kind of served as a wake-up call to Will Howard in the last 2 games. They've used Johnson, kind of sparingly in the first half, and then he gets a lot more second half work, which is really watering down the production for both of them. makes it really difficult to use. Get-ins last week, along with Treshaun Ward, they both scored touchdowns. Get-ins, a couple of receptions as well, back-to-back games of 26 fantasy points. Going up against Texas, not a very good spot. Nobody will be rostering him yet again. Another running back in this game that makes sense for GPPs because he has been so productive and nobody's going to use him. And then the receiving spot for Kansas State, my man Jace Brown got off to a good start, but didn't follow up after the first quarter, so we kind of missed out there. And it became the Phillip Brooks game. He just took off, 5 catches, 83 yards, and a touchdown, which doesn't sound that great, but the game turned out to be 41-0. He did most of that in the first half. Had that been a competitive game, I'm scared to think what he might have actually put up because he was being heavily targeted and focused on throughout. So he's only 4.9 and the guy that we know is going to get targeted. Played 90% of the snaps just on the field for the entire game. That will be the situation here against Texas, but it's another one. Competitive wise, yes, I might want to bet it. I think it's going to be a good one to watch, but for DFS purposes, just like Notre Dame and Clemson, I don't personally feel that excited about using anyone from it. And there's so much exposure coming from the last couple of games on the slate that I'm just kind of hyper focused there. So definitely a intriguing game because there's options, but none of them are main team plays for me. Is that out of whack from what you're thinking, or you kind of feel the same?
I'm kind of same as you on that one. It's not the most exciting spot.
All right. Yeah, there's a few games where it's going to take a while, but we're going to get to some exciting games, I promise. We're going to lean in now with Army Air Force Service Academy game. The Air Force, they're big favorites here, relatively speaking, 18.5, a 32 total. Not the lowest total of the weekend, though, because Iowa and Northwestern, which is not on the main slate, thank God, is like 28.5 or 29, the lowest total in the history of mankind. Pretty wild, but 32 is pretty damn low as well. But these Air Force guys, at least the running backs, represent some decent GPP options. I know this is not a fun game to talk about, but what do we got?
So one thing we actually have had happen is a little bit of consolidation of the running back room with Air Force. And it's nice to see that because like we had earlier in the season kind of been leaning on, Burke and like the fullback dive play working a lot. And that has been something they've got away from each of the last 3 weeks. Burke hasn't seen more than 4 carries in each of the last 3 games. And that volume has mainly gone to Michelle. And so, Michelle, 22 carries, 20 carries. Obviously, like, you don't expect any passing game work from any of these guys. And if they catch one pass, you're doing cartwheels. But Michelle has had amazing volume, especially for a running back that's only 6,400. That's amazing volume. Yes, the game is condensed because it's a Service Academy game on both sides. But Army is also terrible. And so you're going to have that efficiency. And he's going to be the dude. You're going to get 20 plus carries out of him against a terrible run defense. I don't know, how you can get away from that. That's a really solid locked in option. That, if you want to get cute and go to Eldridge and save some money and, maybe Eldridge pilfers a touchdown here and there, but and Eldridge got 11 of those carries. So, those Burke carries that are being lost are probably 60-30 going to Michelle and to Eldridge. So Eldridge is gaining too, but the efficiency has been there more with Michelle, and Eldridge has kind of needed touchdowns, which he has 6 of them. Like, he'll get in the end zone, but he's needed touchdowns to get there. Whereas Michelle has kind of seen the volume without the touchdowns. Kind of have to mention Dane Kenneman.
I was waiting for it. Since you dogged him, he scored 2 touchdowns, so he heard you, man.
Yeah. So 1 catch in each of his last 2 games. One of them went for 9 yards. One of them went for 94 yards, and they each went for touchdowns. And he also had 3 carries in the last game against Colorado State. So at 3,900, he's like with these kind of plays, he's not a lock by any stretch of the imagination, but he's that dude that if he breaks 2 of those 90-yard touchdowns, well, now he's a must-have, right? And so This Army defense is just bad enough that you could see a guy like that, break out and make some guys miss tackles and get loose in the open field. Definitely in play as a GPP salary saving option. But like not a Nick Nash special. We're not getting tons of volume on a $3,900 receiver, but he is a guy that can break one. And then on the Army side, similarly with Rutgers, just no interest at all in the Army side. They are running into exactly the type of defense that and Army does throw it a little bit more than Air Force, which is kind of a funny little thing there. But they're just not going to be competitive in this one. It's going to be all Air Force all the time. And I guess we probably should give a passing mention to Larry Air. He is only 6,500, and obviously he runs the ball a good amount too, from the QB position, and get some of those rushing touchdowns that we like to see from the quarterback position. So he's an interesting option. Probably not a guy I'm forcing into lineups, but would want some exposure to overall in lineups that don't have Michelle, and maybe that do have Kinnaman. So definitely want some exposure to the Air Force guys, want zero exposure to the Army side.
Agree. I think Michelle will see an ownership spike as well because of the work that he's been getting. All right, so we're going to move on here. Texas A&M and Ole Miss. The Rebels are 3-point favorites, 53.5 total. I got to say, this Ole Miss defense, they're not the fantasy-friendly video game-esque unit that they were a couple of years ago. They've actually improved quite a bit from that standpoint, but still a game in which I think we can derive some value from. The price of Evan Stewart sitting there at 6-1 on the A&M side, he started the season out with some big games, caused his price to balloon up over 7. Going into that South Carolina game, we thought there would be some heavy passing volume, and there was to a degree. He had 6 catches for 55 yards, but not the stat line that maybe a lot of us thought he was going to get. Early on, it does seem like he's going to see a decent amount of ownership just because that 6-1 price point, and he is the de facto WR1 playing 90% snaps or more. So he's going to be somebody that I think when you're looking at cash games or your head-to-heads that your opponent's going to have. Just keep that in mind. He's not that exciting to me personally, but definitely the guy to own here, even above Anaya Smith for 1K less. The running back side, we were all over Lev Moss, ended up having a hamstring issue. Just awful reporting. And I want to use this as a moment to say we're on top of it as much as we can be, but we're still at the mercy of people, media, beat writers at the games, unless we're at the game. And I'm not typically at a Texas A&M game, letting them, tell us. And that news didn't come out until very, very late. And it was only a Lev Moss. Oh, someone just noticed Lev Moss isn't on the field. Like all this warm up, an hour, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, like nobody noticed until like 2 minutes to log that Lev Moss wasn't warming up. So that was pretty brutal. Tagged the Discord. I know some people missed it. Tried our best on that one, but that was just one of those things that happened that, is unavoidable sometimes. Does sound like he'll be available for this one. He is not the lock button type of play that he was going into last week's game against SC. It was interesting that Amari Daniels looked pretty good. That just happens to be that the opponent was South Carolina. The first player to get carries was actually Reuben Owens, and he did get 18. So I don't know that injury is going to cause them to slip back into a trio of carries again in a committee, because that's how the season started off. I think Lev Moss is still the best option of the group, but I do worry that they'll end up giving Owens like 5 to 8 carries, Daniels 3 to 5, and it's enough to kind of screw up Moss, even though his 5-1 price point is certainly viable. You have Max Johnson there at 6K. I'm always wanting Johnson to be a play. He keeps getting the passing volume, another 30 attempts last week, 34 before that, 25, 28. It's just not turning into a lot of fantasy viability. He can't run. He's taking a ton of sacks, which is causing him to lose points. And there just hasn't been the touchdowns there. So I continually see him on, there's only a few places you can really find any kind of ownership projections. And I keep seeing him have like a small spike of ownership each week, and I'm starting to feel like they're just doing that to throw people off because he shouldn't really be rostered at this point. Really just Evan Stewart or nobody. On the Ole Miss side, I don't love Jackson Dart, even though the price slipping under 8K is really intriguing, right? After being almost 10K against Vanderbilt, now we're getting him at 7-8. Kind of makes you feel like, oh, damn, did I miss an injury or was there something going on there? It doesn't appear to be the case. He did only have 16 fantasy points. 2 weeks before that, 13. But you look at more competitive games like LSU, 45. Auburn, 28. So games that have been competitive, and this should be one that is exactly like those two. He has been really relied upon for not only passing volume, but he's been able to do stuff with his legs as well. And he's still scoring rushing touchdowns the last few games. So there is a lot of GPP viability there. And this is that type of game. Their Texas A&M games tend to be like lower owned, totals a little bit on the mediocre side compared to the rest of the games, and nobody's really interested, and then suddenly it pops off and there's a lot of fantasy viability everywhere. Also, the fact that Quinshon Judkins is just the guy that everybody loves. He's got back-to-back games of 120 plus yards. 3 games out of his last 4, he's been over 120 as well. Kind of sleptwalked through the first part of the season, but we're starting to see the guy that we know and love from last year. That 6.9 price tag definitely puts him in play. He's basically matchup proof because he's going to get such heavy volume. I tried to get a little cute, ended up having a nice slate either way on that secondary one, which I believe was the night slate for the Ole Miss game. I ended up playing some Ulysses Bentley. He had 7 carries for 42 yards, which was fine for his price, but Judkins just ended up smashing. So he's always in play. And then the receivers, they're all cheap, relatively speaking, for the production we've seen at various times. Trey Harris sitting there at 6'2", Jordan Watkins 5'5", my man Caden Priestcorn is a tight end at 3'8". Not producing a ton of stats just yet for Priestcorn, but he's on the field a lot. Played all but like 5 snaps in that last game. Out there blocking a lot, of course, but he's at 3'8", something that we can consider for some alt builds. Wade's been a pretty solid deep threat. If you want to use anyone here, Watkins is typically the guy I like to look at just because the combination of his snaps and his targets played, or his target share, leads the team in targets right now with 53. Obviously, he's played a game or two more than Trey Harris, but 39 catches, 580 yards, 2 touchdowns. Dayton Wade over 500 yards as well. This is just going to be a really good spot for Ole Miss receivers to kind of break out and Jackson Dart stacks to potentially win GPPs. I think most people are looking towards some of the later part of the slate games, and this one's just going to go ignored. Would not surprise me at all if a Dart triple stack wins the large field GPP, because I don't expect any of those guys to see ownership above 3 to 4%. So that's where I would go if you're looking at this game. But I'm really just kind of waiting my time to talk about the last game. Do you have anybody in this one that you feel particularly strongly about?
Hard to get away from Judkins, man. I mean, like we'd think of him as like an 8K running back, and yeah, I guess it's like more or less a tough matchup. But he gets so much volume and has so much involvement in that offense, and is kind of the thing that makes them tick. Hard to get away from him below 7K.
Definitely. All right, we're gonna jump over to Virginia Tech versus Louisville. Cards come in as 9.5-point favorites. I feel like I'm going to lose money betting Virginia Tech. 48.5 total. Definitely like this game. Feel like there's some sneaky options here on both sides. What do you like in this one?
Yeah, man. So Va Tech comes into this one after blowing the doors off of Syracuse. Last saw them and coming in, with some decent rest as well, that being a Thursday game for them. I kind of like the way that Va Tech offense looked and operated. It's a weird thing to say because they've been pretty gross for kind of a while, but finally seeing some continuity with Kyron Jones, and we do think that Kyron Jones is better than Grant Wells, right?
Oh yeah.
Absolutely. Grant Wells might be healthy or might be trending towards healthy, but can we just kind of keep him in the closet and let Kyron Jones do his thing? Because there's definitely some fantasy goodness to be had. And at 6,300,
Taylor's got to be feeling like, what did we do, right? Like, why did we let this guy leave?
Yeah, exactly. So I hope that like there's a lack of clarity, with with Kyron Jones, so that his ownership stays low, and that people don't just plug him in that super flex spot. But at 6,300, like that's the reason you don't use a Larier is that Drones is cheaper and better and throws the ball. And like that's what that offense wants, is starting to want to do. They've been kind of a 3 yards in a cloud of dust offense until we've unleashed Jones and let him do his thing. And the Louisville run defense is a little bit better than they are against the pass. And so I think that, there will be some volume available to him. The other part of that is Tootin's a little banged up, and so we might not see a full workload from Bashal Tootin, which could lead to more drones. It could also lead to more Malachi Thomas, which is another interesting spot at 4,500. If we get like a hard out on Tootin and we see that volume is going to go to Malachi Thomas at 4,500, that's a really interesting spot too. On the Vatek side, the most amazing thing about this though is that there are potentially 3 viable receivers from Virginia Tech. Like you don't think of Virginia Tech in the same way that you think of like the Ohio State receivers. Like that's not a thing. But if Jennings is back and Lane is kind of that middle ground guy, and you get well, they're all kind of the same price, so it's not really a discount, but you probably get less ownership on DeQuan Felton than you get on the other two because it's not as recognizable of a name. But DeQuan Felton was the one that went off against Syracuse, right? And so did it on 3 catches, had to be pretty efficient, 380 and 2. So it's not like we can expect that to happen, but there, if you want a pairing partner for drones, there's 3 guys right there in the 5K range, mid 5K range. And if Jennings is out, then there's only 2, but if we have all 3 of them, we're going to get all of those guys individually at pretty low ownership. So probably would still lean Lane just for a little bit more guaranteed volume. He went 6 catches for 72 and also had some groundwork. But Felton could be a sneaky play there as well. So a lot of different options on the Vatek side, and I agree with you that I think that spread should be quite a bit closer than it is. Yes, Louisville is at home and can be tough to play, but I don't think Vatek is going to hold anybody else to 10 points this season. But they certainly showed something, and offense seems to be clicking. On the Louisville side, probably not going to plumber. That's not really a thing that I do, because if you want exposure to that passing game, you can get all of it from Thrash. Thrash had 7 catches against Duke, and nobody else had more than 1. That's kind of the consistent theme of the Louisville offense, is the passing work goes to Thrash and the running work goes to usually a lot of different people. In the case of the most recent game against Duke, however, we did see some consolidation with Jawar Jordan. If you believe that this is a Jawar Jordan backfield and he's going to get 20 plus touches again against what is typically a pretty bad run defense, even though they did a good job of stopping Syracuse, I don't see them doing that same thing against Louisville. At 6,700, I think that's a pretty compelling price for Jawar Jordan, and want a lot of exposure there. So it's kind of the same thing that we have to figure out with the Ohio State lineups. Do you want this to be a Jawar Jordan lineup, or do you want this to be a Thrash lineup? Is a very similar decision. Do you want it to be a Travion Henderson lineup, or do you want it to be a Marvin Harrison lineup? The difference is Thrash is only 6,600. He's not 8,900. And so it's pretty much just an even exchange with, getting the $100 discount to go to Thrash. Vatek typically a little bit better against the pass, might lead to some lower ownership on Thrash than we would expect him to be if he's at that price. People are going to see that, you know, high ranking in the DraftKings app. You know, Vatek is 16th against the pass. I don't think that is really going to apply to Thrash because he's going to get a ton of volume. And so, you know, given the 2 and Jordan coming off of the massive game that he had, well, that was mainly game script driven. They shut Duke out. They didn't need to throw the ball a lot. And that's, you know, the only thing that kept Thrash from hitting his ceiling. So I would probably lean Thrash if deciding between the 2, but I definitely want exposure to both in different lineups. As far as secondary options on the Louisville side, I mean, Amari Huggins-Bruce has a lot of talent and shows up twice a season. He's done it once. He did it against Boston College. He, you know, still only had 3 catches in that game, but he scores long touchdowns. That's kind of his calling card. If you were to do an alternate receiver besides Thrash, that would probably be my guy. He is there at 3.9, the Dane Kinnaman price. And so, you know, in a super alt GPP build, you could go that route, but I think I'm just going mainly Thrash on that side. Definitely a game that if you want a game stack, I see nothing wrong with that. I also, in addition to Vatek, you know, covering that 9.5, I also see them going well over that 48.5 total, flying over that pretty easily. So absent, you know, some crazy wind or rain or something that affects the playing conditions, I see this being a pretty high scoring game.
Yeah, man. I like there might be some same game parlay action here, like Virginia Tech plus 9.5 over 48.5. That seems pretty good to me. I love the drones play. There's probably realistically for me 3 or 4 quarterbacks that I'm considering for my primary lineup, and he's definitely one of them. And I like the idea of Jennings, you know, milling around because he's really good if healthy. And I still, every time Louisville's on the slate, I go down, I'm like, Joey Gatewood, man, I'd be nice to see him play because he's got a lot of talent. But yeah, I think this is a real good game to bet on, and I'm on board with drones. All right, next game here we're going to talk about is Florida State versus Pittsburgh. Florida State, big favorites, 21.5, 50-point total. Pittsburgh, man, they also, I want to just say before I get into that you mentioned the red there in the 16th defense or whatever. Like, I love, because there is people who actually look at that and base off their lineups like half the time, or 75% of the time DraftKings is way off with that. So just a good shout out for that people actually look at that stuff, and that is something that you can use to your advantage for ownership purposes. All right, the Pittsburgh, man, this defense, they're turning into quite the fantasy friendly group. And speaking of Kieran Drones, when they played Pittsburgh, he just had 5 touchdowns, like real casual, you know, rush for 2, threw for 3, mobile quarterback like this guy on Florida State, and Jordan Travis, and Emory Jones of Cincinnati. You know, he's kind of struggled this season, but he was decent against them, and lately, you know, underestimated, tore them up. This is a good spot for Florida State, and I know that we're paying a premium price for Jordan Travis, who is always the elite GPP play, and he would have won, you know, if you used him last week, all the bucks for you. 38 fantasy points, 3 touchdown passes, 1 rushing touchdown, almost 400 yards. 9K is a steep price, but it's on the road. I know they're 3 touchdown favorites, but maybe Pittsburgh can score a little bit. I love Jordan Travis this week. I think we can fit him in because of some of this value. He's definitely not the number 1 quarterback for me, but he's in this, like, that group of 4 or 5 I'm talking about. He's probably in like the 2 or 3 realm for me. So I definitely love him. There is also a pretty good chance that Johnny Wilson returns. Even if he's not available, Keon Coleman has been so freaking elite. Just been an unbelievable. Jaheim Bell is doing just enough to be productive. You look at the FSU targets, Coleman up to 61 now because Wilson's missed a couple of games. 538 yards, 9 touchdowns, just ridiculously good. And then you have Bell there with 26, 342, and 2. So this offense is quite good. If you can't pay the price for Travis, it's definitely worth looking at Trey Benson. because running backs have also been doing fairly decent against Pittsburgh. Not 200 rushing yards, but there's a lot of 75 to 100-yard games with multiple touchdowns. Benson had a real big game last week, but he caught 4 passes for 100 yards and a touchdown, which is a big reason why. He just rushed for 55 yards, but also scored a touchdown on the ground. So he's a bit spendy at 6'8", but I think you want exposure to this Florida State team. I really do think they're going to put up another big score and continue their momentum, and they're also going to be pretty jacked. Speaking of the playoff, they're in a prime position there if they continue. And Jordan Travis, maybe there's some Heisman, viability there if he continues to just smash. So I love him. I don't think you need to play somebody with him. Coleman at 7K still a bit spendy, even though he's just been ridiculous. To me, it's like a Travis running him naked type of thing. On the Pittsburgh side, they gave my guy Christian Valu the start, but he's been struggling. But he's had some really tough matchups. Notre Dame was awful. He did actually pretty damn good against Wake Forest, all things considering, on 45 pass attempts. I think he's going to have to throw probably 35 to 40 again. At 5'2", you got a throwaway lineup. You want to maybe use him, you can. Also, Sibo Flemister at 4'4". If there is a spot against this FSU defense where some players can perform, it's definitely on the ground. Predictably, Flemister didn't do well against his former team in Notre Dame's, eight carries for 24 yards. I do think we see him get back into the 10 to 15 touch realm at minimum, only 4'4". Somebody to consider for GPP value if you need it. And then the receiving group for Pittsburgh, it's pretty much a two-man game. Bub Means and Kanata Mumfield both have 55 targets. Both have right around 390 yards. And then Mumfield with 4 touchdowns, Means with 3 touchdowns. Neither a main team play, but Bub Means at 4.7 definitely represents a solid amount of GPP value too. There are really cheap receivers on this slate that we can use, and he's going to be a sub 5% owned guy, even though he scored 10 plus fantasy points in 4 straight games. Really big game against Wake Forest, adequate games against Virginia Tech and Louisville, and just getting peppered with a ton of targets here, especially with Valu under center. He seems to like Bub Means quite a bit. And that is pretty much it. Gavin Bartholomew is not the touchdown machine that he was in years past, so I don't really have to look at him either. For me, I'm kind of zeroing in on Jordan Travis and just trying to make that decision. Once I get an idea of which running backs I'm actually paying for, then I can determine if I'm actually going to fade Travis or use him. But right now, he's a top 3 quarterback for me, and I realize 9K is a steep price, but I think he's going to put up 30 plus against these guys again. Just the amount of opportunity cost there that might hurt the rest of our lineup. So I know you're usually in on Travis for GPPs as well. Do you kind of feel like, man, we do need to start paying attention to maybe using him in our main lineup again, or is it still kind of GPP territory for you?
I mean, it's getting to the point where it's like not fadeable or not completely fadeable, right? Like he's been that consistent, and even in blowouts, like he's still the useful score. You want to see, at least 30 and approaching closer to 40 at that point, and he's doing it even in blowouts. So it's like, in the off chance this game somehow stays competitive, man, he could push 50, right? And so you're on the road. You have a marginally competent offense, and maybe get into a little bit of a dogfight and keep him live for all 4 quarters. And he could get there. So probably not locking him into like 70% of lineups or anything, but definitely want some exposure here and there.
Yeah, it's getting hard to be having no lineups with Travis or any relevant 3 to 5 lineup type thing. You just got to have them. Random thought before I move on here. ASU, speaking of Johnny Wilson, ASU could have had Jaden Daniels, Johnny Wilson, and Ricky Parcell this year. So kind of a weird thought there. But let's move on to Penn State versus Maryland. This is an interesting game because I keep waiting for the Penn State running backs to do anything that's fantasy viable. In Maryland, we've had one of our subs really kind of call out how terrible they were going to be, and they have been. at least for fantasy purposes. Totals 50. Penn State's 8.5-point favorites. That's close enough to get Singleton and Katron Allen some work here. But are we going to be able to finally pull the trigger on them, or are we just kind of, feeling indifferent and they're just mediocre at this point? I don't know.
I mean, I really do think it would take an injury, or last minute somebody gets the flu, and we're going to see consolidation into one of those two backs in order to focus on them. Also, cursory mention of Aller. It wasn't quite the ultimate get right spot that I was hoping for from Drew Aller. He did throw for 3 touchdowns. Didn't get to the yardage, didn't have any involvement in the ground game. But 210 yards and 3 touchdowns against Indiana last week. He did connect for one of those with Keandre Lambert-Smith on a 57-yarder, which is, kind of exactly what we talked about here on the show. Was we're gonna see him really develop that connection with Keandre Lambert-Smith, and that came to fruition. 6 catches each of the last 3 weeks for Keandre Lambert-Smith. Caught the touchdown this past weekend against Indiana. I think we are going to see him break that elusive 100-yard barrier this week. He hasn't done that since week 1 of this season. But I think we are going to see him get there here, in no small part due to them, having really no other main receiving threat. It's, it was Harrison Wallace for a while, but it's really just Keandre Lambert-Smith and the tight ends, Theo Johnson and Tyler Warren at this point. And so any vertical passing routes that are connected on are very likely going to be Keandre Lambert-Smith. So that's a guy that I definitely want exposure to. I think Maryland can be beaten over the top, and I think is pretty suspect in the secondary in general. So I'm pretty, again, heavily interested in KLS. I can't really pick one of the two. I would love to, like you said, between Singleton and Allen. Probably would lean Singleton, as he seems to be like more of the very, very slight 1A in the 1A 1B situation. Probably has a little bit more explosiveness too. But I think that this is going to be a Keandre Lambert-Smith runs wild kind of game, and the running back split touches and both go for like 10 to 12 carries and 60 yards, maybe a touchdown, maybe not, but it's not an overwhelmingly exciting game from either of the running backs. Whereas, 6, 125 and 1 at 6,500 would be a really good game from Keandre Lambert-Smith. So that's my focus on that one. And then, I would love to say I had a run back for you on the Maryland side. They are more likely to produce than like Rutgers is. But I don't see a consolidated passing game on that side. I mean, there's always like the Caden Prather shout, and he'll show up every now and then. Might see Jashawn Jones have a repeat of what he did against Northwestern, but we all know Penn State's not Northwestern, right? So he saw a ton of volume, 9 catches for 78 yards, and a touchdown last week, but going up against a much tougher defense, not going to see, might see that same kind of volume, probably won't see, much efficiency in terms of being able to convert targets into catches and run after the catch. That's probably not going to be there in that same way. And then Ty Felton is another shout. Obviously a little bit of a discount on all these Maryland receivers, but not going to see the kind of efficiency that I would want to. And then we, have the Maryland running back discussion that's always so fun. It's tough to play any running back against Penn State. Obviously, pretty nails defense. And then it's, what are you going to do with Roman Hemby? Is he going to see 15 touches and score 3 touchdowns, or is he going to see 6 touches and do nothing? I think against Penn State, he's probably a lot more likely to see 6 touches and do nothing. and then have just, other running backs rotate in or them throw a lot of incomplete passes and turn the ball over, get in, third and long situations where Roman Hemby's not even on the field or relevant. So probably just a total pass for me on the Maryland side, and mainly want my exposure to Keandre Lambert-Smith on the Penn State side.
Yeah, Maryland just doesn't do it for me. I wanted them to, because coming into the last 2 seasons, they've had a really strong receiver room, but just kind of over the whole situation with Maryland. So, I would be inclined to agree, ignoring them and just kind of sprinkling in some Penn State. I think there's a betting opportunity here. I know the 8. I would have liked like a 3.5. It's kind of steep, but I think they can win by 10 plus even on the road. So we'll move along here to Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State. 61.5 total. One of the only games with a total that high on the slate. 6-point favorites are Oklahoma. Starting with the Oklahoma State side, they are dealing with a plethora of injuries at the receiver position, and they have been for pretty much the whole season. We know Stribling's out for the year, but heading into last week's game, they ended up missing Jaden Bray and Blaine Green, so both had to sit out. They've been using Rashad Owens and Presley, but they had to call upon a D3 transfer who almost nobody knows in Leon Johnson, and he ended up playing 67 plays, 5 catches, 149 yards, just a massive, massive breakout game. He was supposed to redshirt for this game, but that was his 4th game playing. He played in 3 others, but didn't get targets. There might have to burn his red shirt. I've been reading a few reports here. They wanted to maintain it for next year, but especially with that kind of talent that he showed. But depending on the injury situation to Green and Bray, they may have to utilize him again. And this Oklahoma defense, the last 3 weeks, really, they've really faltered, and they got away with it against Texas. They got away with it against UCF. They did not get away with it against Kansas. They finally got caught with the hand in the proverbial cookie jar, as they say. I'm kind of down on the Sooners, not necessarily their offense, but defensively, this team I think they're going to be giving up some points here. And the way this Oklahoma State team has looked, regardless of injuries, I think we're going to see a pretty high scoring affair, probably heading towards the 70s. And Alan Bowman, he's not really a play. He's getting a ton of volume. His price at 6.2. It's definitely okay. But we can imagine he's going to throw another 35 to 40 passes. Just doesn't do anything on the ground game. He doesn't have to score a huge number. Like at the 6.2, he could put up 20 to 22 and actually probably end up being semi of optimal. So I don't hate the idea of that. And I'm going to be keeping a close eye on Leon Johnson, because I also read a story about when Bowman came in, they transferred in the same time. And in the spring, they bunked together, and he was the first receiver he met and threw to, and they've got chemistry. And that clearly showed last week when he was asked to come in and play a ton of snaps, and he performed quite well. 4 or 5's it's a high enough price to really hurt you if he blanks, but that's something that's worth looking at there with the injuries and everything. And then, of course, Ollie Gordon, who comes into a matchup that, on paper isn't the best against running defense, but there's no way to fade this guy. He's just putting up ridiculous numbers. He had that big game against Kansas. Like, okay, the Kansas rush defense sucks. West Virginia, they were pretty decent against the run. He made them look foolish. Then he followed that up in against Cincinnati with another 271-yard performance. That kind of production does not go by anyone. Casual players, grinders, everybody alike is going to be rostering Ollie Gordon. So you just have to kind of just plug him in. It's a heat check play for sure, but if he's not 40% owned in most contests, it would be a true shock to me. I'm just going to continue to play a guy that has, over 500 yards in 3 games, because that's just ridiculous. Likely going to continue to see 30-plus touches as well, and we're going to look at a competitive game in which Oklahoma's defense is starting to fall apart, and Dylan Gabriel is still playing really, really well. So that's an obvious play to use there in Ollie Gordon. So RB1, obviously. Quarterback, I mentioned the group of 4 to 5. Dylan Gabriel's definitely in it. It was funny because to start the season, he kept producing. Nobody used it, kind of called that out, and nobody was really rostering him. The last 2 or 3 slates, he's been really high owned. The 8-9 price tag is very doable. We're getting a discount compared to last week when he was 9-4 and the week before 9-3. The passing volume wasn't there against Kansas, but he ended up rushing 3 touchdowns in. We saw that, kind of sneaky rushing upside that he flashes every few games. This is going to be a game where I think he does end up throwing 35 to 40 times, but he has that potential to throw 3 touchdowns and score 2 touchdowns on the ground and really shatter a slate here and put up something like 44, 45 points like he did against Iowa State. Happened to be a game in which he scored 5 touchdowns. I kind of feel like this one sets up for him quite well, especially with the kind of uncertainty and rolling rotation of running backs that we have here between Marcus Major being banged up, not being banged up, Tyree Walker, returning. They gave him a hell of a lot of touches, 23 carries against Kansas. He played really well, but his ankle banged up. He's a game time decision again. Like, he just can't seem to stay on the field, whether it's suspensions or injuries. We could see Gavin Sawchuk be a thing again. Still got 6 carries last week and scored a touchdown in back-to-back games. So he's still hovering around. The team really wants Javonte Barnes to get healthy. It was, he finally, first bit of action there in 6 weeks, 5 carries, only 17 yards, did get a reception as well. So don't be surprised if Barnes, workload kind of starts to materialize and him start to push over double digits here, depending on how his health is, because he's the running back they actually want to feature. But it's really just, 4 guys, injuries, suspensions, all this stuff. You got Dylan Gabriel, just use him. And then when it comes to the Oklahoma receivers, Nick Anderson, you had that call against UCF. He panned out well. We saw him, revert back to low targets. Didn't do a lot last week. Unfortunately, Jaleel Farouk is really difficult to use on a game-to-game basis because it's just, there's no consistent with his targets. And then Drake Stoops seems to be the only one from a PPR standpoint that we know he's going to reel in 4 to 5 receptions. It's not going to be a huge yardage. He's not going to put up a huge score, but he's probably going to score 8 to 15 fantasy points. So if you need a pairing option with Gabriel, you have safety in Drake Stoops, but 5'9" for him doesn't feel very good. You have a ton of upside at 5'6" for Anderson, but he has the potential to really blank out on you. However, this matchup against Okie State is definitely one in which we could see him, reel in 6-7 passes, 200 yards, 3 touchdowns. He has that kind of upside, this matchup, this defense. So don't sleep on him. Don't fade him completely if you're a multi-enterer, because he's definitely going to have a potential bounce back game here. But I love Ollie Gordon like everybody else. Dylan Gabriel is certainly the guy. I would be more inclined to run him without a pairing option, but I know that's hard for people to do. So Stoops or Anderson would be the look there. And then if you're running 50 plus lineups, 100 plus, 150 plus, then you can start getting into these Oklahoma running backs. But for now, it's just too difficult to peg them. Unless we get news that, hey, Tyree Walker's out, Major's still out, then Barnes is going to get all these carries. I would be inclined to use Barnes in a GPP lineup at 4-3 because he is really good. He just hasn't been able to stay on the field. But this is definitely a game where betting purposes, I've already had a bet on the total, and I think I might get some more in there before it's all said and done, because this may be the highest scoring game on the slate. There's one other that looks juicy, but this one's definitely one of the cream of the crop. What do you think? You got anything to add?
Nothing other than what was going on. I didn't get a chance to watch the game last week. What was going on with Dylan Gabriel? I mean, was he throwing right-handed? 171 yards in a game that they lost against Kansas. I understand they just ran the ball the whole time, but at a certain point when you're losing, hey, maybe we should get down the field a little quicker kind of thing. What happened?
Yeah, no, well, he got picked off relatively early, and then suddenly the play calling got really conservative. I was talking to somebody in DMs about that, and it was like they just kind of got stuck in neutral and never seemed to be able to get out of it. And the play calling was some of the most bizarre stuff that I'd ever seen. And when they were throwing it, it wasn't like they weren't having success, but they also weren't able to beat up on that Kansas defense at all. There was nobody getting open as far as the secondary goes, and they just had the success running the ball. So they continued to do so, but yeah, they eventually just ran out of time. So it was very bizarre game for sure.
It was just kind of one of those things where you open up the box, you open up Oklahoma lost. That's weird. Oh, but they scored like 30 points. Okay, Dylan Gabriel must have like 300 yards and 3 touchdowns. And dig a little further. Okay, well, he got the 3 touchdowns, but not passing, and he didn't get anywhere near the yardage. What the heck happened in this one? It was a tough one to kind of reverse engineer. But yeah, just weird game overall, but definitely bounce back spot, rivalry game. It's what the guy lives for, and it's hard for me to get away from Dylan Gabriel at any price.
For sure, yeah. No, the interception was a pick six too, but it was so weird because they're having all this success running the ball, but eventually it's like, hey, we're running out of time. We need to do something, and I don't know. It was very bizarre. This Oklahoma team, I don't know. I'm somewhat worried about them, honestly, but not worried about Dylan Gabriel, obviously. All right, moving on here, we got Missouri versus Georgia. Georgia has 15-point favorites, 56.5 total. I know you're going to be loving your guy McConkey, who did some nice things. I always like Luther Burden, but against Georgia, that might be tough. An intriguing game, but I'm not quite sure how I want to approach this one for DFS. Looking forward to hearing your breakdown on this one.
So Missouri has had a run of terrible quarterback play that they've seen on the other side of the football. That was a weird way to state that. Basically, they haven't faced a good quarterback since Jaden Daniels a month ago. And they are going to run into what I think is starting to become a pretty consistent, reliable quarterback in Carson Beck. And I can guarantee you Carson Beck is not going to run for 150 yards and a touchdown. That's just not his game. But I think he's absolutely going to carve up this Missouri defense. I think they're not going to be able to keep up. I think that there's going to be guys running wide open all over the field. And yes, McConkey's going to be one of those. And he's coming into this with all kind of confidence, winning the rivalry game against Florida at the neutral site and coming back home to, finish off the rest of the season and put his name on the map. Not that Carson Beck's a Heisman contender, but he's going to be in the limelight for the rest of the season, and he's going to need to really show up with, the CFP out and somehow Georgia not in first place in that. They're going to have to put up some style points, right? So I think Carson Beck will be involved in all aspects of this one. I guess putting up 43 against Florida is not enough, and they're going to need to hang 50 on Missouri to get everyone to pay attention. So I actually really like Carson Beck. I know that there are some lower priced quarterbacks. There's probably some quarterbacks that you're a little bit more into than a traditionally pocket passing, Georgia quarterback. It's kind of like, hey, would you play Stetson Bennett at 8.5 in this spot? Well, maybe I would in this spot, right? And so I think that there's enough experience and rapport that even without Bowers, I think we can see a Carson Beck ceiling game. So little bit weird to say, but he's probably the quarterback that I'm the highest on this week, even with that $8,500 price tag. Does not mean that I'm not high on Edwards. I love Edwards too. I always do. And you can definitely run on Missouri as well. We've seen that, Ray Davis had some big yardage against them. And even with Jaden Daniels running the ball, LSU got some productivity out of their running back Diggs. He ran it 24 times himself for 134 and a touchdown. The South Carolina game is a little bit different because they didn't really do much. It offensively only scored 12 points overall. But I think that Edwards can do it. It's just he's at 73 and Ollie Gordon's at 72, and between those two, I think 100 times out of 100, I'm probably going with Ollie Gordon, just relative to price. And there's those backs that we've talked about that are a little bit lower priced than Edwards that are equally involved in their respective offenses and are going to have a lot of volume and probably some more efficiency, and also the offenses are going to be more focused on running the ball. I think this is going to be a pass heavy game for Georgia while they try to put up points in a hurry and get Carson Beck some national exposure. as far as who the receivers are that are going to be the beneficiaries of the pass heavy attack, yeah, Lad McConkey, man. 6 for 120 something, 130 something, 6 for 135 and 1. Great Lad McConkey game. Got him going. Love to see it. Him and Keandre Lambert-Smith, man. If you listen to me more than I listen to me and you put both of them in your lineups last week, you did really well. But I'm going to go right back to the well here. 5,800 is too low. He's probably a 7K receiver with no Bowers to take up that target share. Hard to go a lot of other places with confidence in this receiver room. Obviously, Don Lovett, revenge game. Could he see, 7 or 8 catches in this one and, some explosive plays, maybe gets in the end zone? Problem is he only has the 1 touchdown all season. And so, I think they're probably going to look more to McConkey when they get towards the red zone. But you could also see Lovett break a big one just, with him being more expensive. I'm probably going to trend McConkey. Rosemy Jackson, never really see a high volume game out of him. Got some other shouts in there with Delp and Dylan Bell. If you want to throw a cheapy Georgia receiver in there in your Carson Beck stacks, feel free to do that. It's just you're playing pretty thin games with anybody other than McConkey or Lovett, and either of those two I think are going to be good plays. I just have a slight preference for McConkey. On the other side, probably not playing Brady Cook, even though he's been pretty phenomenal this year within the realm of expectations of what we thought Brady Cook was going to be. The even more impressive guy has been Cody Schrader, man. That guy has put up some massive games. Not going to expect that out of him against Georgia. That's a tough ask. But seeing a good amount of volume, 20 plus carries in each of his last 2 at 6,200. That's a tough sell. Would rather get to Travion or Michelle or a guy like that in that price range. It's Georgia, man. You're going to be chasing points and you're going to need to throw the ball. And running into the teeth of that defense seems pretty tough. So then the obvious run back with your Beck and your McConkey or whoever you choose. Maybe Lovett on the Georgia side. The obvious run back is Luther Burden. At 6'9", you're gonna need a really big game out of Luther Burden. Good news is Luther Burden puts up really big games. He is probably fadeable at that price point. We might see, some double coverage on him or some extra attention being paid to him because they don't have, a 1B type of receiver. Theo Weiss is not that. We've seen him pop off from time to time, but it's typically been against inferior competition with weak defenses. I think Mookie Cooper is probably actually the better alt play just because he's not going to get anywhere near the attention that Burden is going to get. But we don't really see a massive discount on Weiss or Cooper. They're both above 5K. And I don't necessarily feel the need to throw a run back into, my Beck and McConkey lineups. I kind of just want to see, Missouri punt the ball a lot or 3 and outs or turnovers or something and the ball back in the hands of Georgia and letting them do their thing. So I don't know, man. Are you thinking you got to force Burden in overall or especially in game stacks, or what are you thinking on Burden?
I always love Burden, but it's tough for me to want to plug him in because even though, I don't know, I feel like Georgia's lost some luster, but they really haven't. And I just feel like they're going to be equipped to slow Burden down. We saw Kentucky's defense, which is not Georgia level, but it's pretty solid. I know they gave up a bunch of points to Missouri, but they made an active decision to just clamp him, and he ended up being a decoy. He's been great in every other game, and few teams are able to do that. But if a team can do that, it would be Georgia. So I think I'm leaning towards the fade there. I love the Carson Beck call. I ended up with for the first time all season, I ended up with Beck last week, but not because I started there. It's because I had to fumble, the Moss news with 2 minutes, and I had to make these swaps, and I ended up having like salary left, 9K. I was like, what do I do now? Oh, I guess I'll play Carson Beck against Florida. Threw for 300 yards, 25 points. Would have liked more, but yeah, he seems like such a safe option here. So I do like that call. I kind of feel like I want some Beck again, but I'm not sure if I'll land there. But yeah, you get all the credit for the McConkey call last week. You finally busted out. You've been waiting for that, so well deserved. This is going to be a really nice game for Georgia, but I do think Missouri, their offense is good enough to score some points here, but I fear that Burden might not pay off that almost 7K price tag. So I'll be lean on him for the most part. All right, so that takes us to the last game on the slate, which is the one I've really been kind of excited to talk about. James Madison versus Georgia State. The total's 53. I think we have over potential there. And then JMU, the Dukes, are 6-point favorites. We can expect some fairly heavy ownership from everyone, your opponents and friends alike. The pricing in this game is basically broken. We'll start with Georgia State. Marcus Carroll, at least they got him to a price point at 7K where it's like, okay, he's not 4 or 5, but I think I would have been willing to pay, upwards of 8K for him in this matchup. The Dukes have not faced very many running backs of Carroll's quality. The other thing going for Carroll is the fact that he's playing almost every snap, getting every carry, every rushing yard available. Last week against Georgia Southern on 28 attempts, 208 yards, 26 carries the week before, 28, 19, 29. He does a little bit in the passing game, 1 to 3 receptions typically. It's just the amount of volume this guy gets. You're basically locking in like you'd be looking if you're playing college basketball, your 7K guys, like, basic math, right? We're looking for 28 points. He could probably put up a 4X number at this price and be really, really just dialed in for nearly 30 points. So that's the first one to me. I'm like, okay, it's not a total misprice, but it's not enough to push the ownership off. I'm expecting him to be one of the higher owned running backs on the slate that's not named Ollie Gordon. Quarterback wise, I do think we get a little bit of sneak with Darren Granger setting all, he's going to have all these records by the time it's all said and done. He was relatively popular on some early season slates. He's always on showdowns and stuff like that, obviously. He hasn't been putting up huge numbers in his last 5, but his dual threat upside makes him a very good GPP look. 7K, he's capable of scoring, 4 or 5 touchdowns, a couple on the ground, of course. He has the receivers around him to do damage, but he's much more of a mobile, much more known for his mobility. But I do like him for GPP purposes there at 7K. And then they have some injuries in their receiver room, but their WR1 alpha is Robert Lewis, who sits there at 6'3". Now, both of these defenses, especially in the secondary, are giving up a ton of yardage, almost 300 yards per game through the air. So we're talking about some real bad secondaries that are going to just get lit up. Robert Lewis had 12 receptions for 97 yards. Very Indiana Hoosier of him to have a stat line like that, but heavy targets. 66 on the season, 46 catches, almost 700 yards and 6 touchdowns. So Lewis is your number one Georgia State receiver option. In that particular game, he had 17 targets. So not so sure he'll get that much again, but I don't think we'll see him under 10 again for the rest of the season for targets, and definitely not in this game where he's going to be very difficult for the JMU secondary to cover. If you want a lower owned option that's, still got some upside at 5.2, you can use the WR2, which is Talik Williams. He did not have a very good game because of all those targets that went to Lewis, so that would probably push people away. But you only have to go back a game or two to see he does have upside. 6 catches for 130 yards and a touchdown against Marshall, 6 catches for 81 yards the game after that. So not the consistent option that Lewis is, but when it comes to GPP lower owned guys, Talik Williams makes a lot of sense. And he's in that range 4.5 to 5.5 where I'm really looking to fill my receivers. So especially with the injury to Krettel, makes a lot of sense to go that way. On the JMU side, it's stack city for me. I am all over Jordan McLeod. The 8-1 price point, that might make some people shudder, but then the box score chasers will look and be like, oh, wow, he's playing really well. heavy passing volume, 40 attempts in their last game, hasn't been below 30 in the last 3 games, only once below that mark in the past 5, has 3+ touchdowns in 4 of his last 5, and he has a rushing touchdown in 3 of his last 5. So Jordan McLeod's just absolutely smacking right now. For the year, he has 210 rushing yards, 4 rushing touchdowns, but over 2,000 passing yards in 8 games, which is strong for him. 18 touchdowns and 6 interceptions, primed for a huge game. Should be one of the chalkier options, though. So I'm not telling you anything that you probably haven't figured out if you've looked at the slate already. When it comes to JMU running backs, they'll be low owned, and that makes sense. We used Kalen Black way back in week 2 against Virginia. He wasn't bad. He did get a touchdown for us at 4.2. 5.2 is a little bit different. He seems to be stuck in this kind of like mid-teens range, which would be fine. He is getting about 10 to 15 touches, but there are enough being lost to Tyson Lawton, which is really kind of lowering his overall upside. And then Latrell Palmer is still kind of nagging around with 2 to 5 carries, which obviously isn't enough to use, but it's enough to really take away from Black. So you're not using those running backs in your main. Maybe you want to get a GP shot in there with Black because it is cheap, and we did, put up a 30 a few weeks back. So he's definitely capable and is better receiver than I think he is a ball carrier, even though he's a running back. So that's where you get your value with him as a kind of a pass catcher. And then we get to the receivers. There's pretty much 2 of them. I mean, there's multiple with 40+ targets, Phoenix Sproles being one, but he's not the one that we're really looking to use. Reggie Brown, who has been fantastic all season, 61 targets, 34 catches, 691 yards, and 6 touchdowns. And then the recently emerging Elijah Sarrett, 48 targets, 39 catches, 592 yards, and 4 touchdowns. So that has been fan-freaking-tastic. 9 targets in each of the last 2 games, 100+ yards in 2 of his last 3. Super efficient. He's not popping these, 15 target games, but he's just catching everything thrown his way. 82% catch rate for Elijah Surratt. So you look at these guys' prices, 4.8 for Elijah, 5K for Reggie, and you got to wonder, wow, what were they thinking there with as good as these guys have been? Every publication is going to be hyping them to the point that you're not going to be able to fade them. And you know how I am with ownership. Like, I won't play a guy just because they're highly owned, but I will play chalk if it's amazingly good. And both of those guys are amazingly good in this matchup. So for me, it's an automatic triple stack, McLeod, Brown, Elijah. It's way too cheap. Even if Elijah, he goes like 4 for 40 and a touchdown, like we're going to be like, damn it, why didn't he do more? But we're not dead. And he's going to be so highly owned. And Brown, I mean, this guy just is incredible. He had the 1 catch for 19-yard game a few weeks back, and it was like, what was that all about? Because every other game he's typically just been smashing. So that would obviously be a disaster at any ownership. But at this point, in this matchup, in this price, it's going to be really difficult to justify a fade of Reggie Brown. But everybody is going to be having those 2 guys, or at least one of them, with McLeod in a lot of lineups, at least in single entry, head-to-heads, winner-take-alls, that kind of thing. So you know what you're up against there. If you want to get cute in some of your other lineups and maybe, one of those guys really has a bad game, or maybe Phoenix Sproles, who nobody's going to roster at 3.7, has a big game. He's actually been pretty consistent and has been performing quite well. 3.7, any other slate that would be hard-pressed for value, we'd be talking about rostering him on our main lineup because this guy has 30 catches, 200 yards, 2 touchdowns, pretty decent catch rate, and has been involved in on 75% of the snaps. So this is a really good game to target. It's a stack. It's for the traditional run back stackers. Like, you got the passing game in JMU, you got the running back on Georgia State. Like, it just sets up for a very obvious high-owned stack that I feel really good about. But I do, it's not lost on me that these guys are all going to be like 35% owned. At worst, probably 50% owned in the contests I play. So do you have I'm sure you looked at it as well. And it also is the highest total, which there are a lot of people, believe it or not, who just go to a slate, look at totals. Oh, wow, this is a 60, 70 total. I'm just going to play 4 guys in it regardless. So that's also going against us here for ownership. Do you feel like you're falling in line with that and taking the let's beat them somewhere else, or you trying to maybe, I don't know, only play one of those guys?
It's interesting because it's like I I either want to fully stack that game or I want to completely fade or put like just one piece in there and you just hope that like one guy gets kind of all the volume. Like if you take the take the McLeod side, like maybe he only throws to one receiver or something, and just take that receiver. But yeah, I mean at that price, it's really hard to get away from Carroll. It's just, you're also allocating a lot of money to running backs if you have both Carroll and Ollie Gordon in a lineup, right? So you gotta balance that out too. And if I'm going Carson Beck, well, it's going to be really tough to get all of Carson Beck and McLeod and those really expensive running backs. Like at a certain point, you got to make some decisions. And there's not, and at least that I've seen, there's not a lot of like, 3-7 to 4-3 type of value receivers that we can use to really make a lineup like that and rely upon, at least that I've found so far, other than our boy Kinnaman. So, absent that revealing itself, it's going to be tough to get to the construction that would allow me to kind of fully stack this game, even with some of those cheaper prices on the receivers, because the running backs are going to be so expensive that I want to get to.
Yeah, definitely. And I talking about Travis, I'm looking at a lineup like to fit the guys that I want. My last two spots are an average of 4-4. And yeah, it's going to end up having to, if I do that, take a shot at one of the receivers that I'm not that comfortable with. So may find myself going to a drones after all with McLeod, which I still feel pretty good about. But yeah, the pricing is just stiff enough on those running backs to maybe keep people from mindlessly plugging them all in. But I'm sure going to try for sure. So let's get, before we move on to PrizePicks and stuff, let's get a core from you on DraftKings, and then let's kind of talk about some FanDuel stuff, and then we'll move along. So where are you sitting with your core at the moment?
So I think we're gonna go with Carson Beck. I'll leave Ollie Gordon to you, and I'll go Travion Henderson at running back, and I'll go Ladd McConkey at receiver.
Love it, yeah. For sure. I think the McLeod play is just way too good. Running backs wise, yes, Ollie Gordon, everyone to have him. I would say Carroll, like I'll core Carroll because maybe there's just enough people who can't because of Ollie Gordon. And then at receiver, it's just the JMU guys. I'm not very imaginative there. Going over to FanDuel to talk about their slate, they have the Huskies versus your USC, which we have time. We cruise through the slate where we can get your take there. You had already mentioned you're gonna bet a lot on the Huskies because I think it was like what -3, -4, something like that. Obviously on FanDuel pricing is different. Like Rome is 10K. But everybody beats up on that USC defense. The Mendoza game that you called was solid. We have to find a way on FanDuel to just plug in everyone. Michael Penix at 11.5, yes. Jalen Polk at 9.7, yes. We're not even getting a discount on Polk anymore. He's only 300 less than Rome because he's been so phenomenal. There's injuries galore to our secondary receivers, and not Jalen McMillan. It's not a secondary guy, but Jeremy Bernard, Giles Jackson. So there might be the tight end, spot like a Devin Culp at 5.5, a Jack Westover 6.3. Been waiting to use those tight ends. This might be the time to finally start looking at some tight ends here, but otherwise, we just got to slam Washington. LSU and Alabama is on that slate too. I know it's Alabama, but Jaden Daniels has been just, I got to cuss, fucking amazing. He's been way too good. I mean, I've told myself the rest of the way, any slate that Jaden Daniels is on, I'm just going to play him. That's going to test me a lot because it's going to be hard to fit him at 11.8. FanDuel's got some stiff pricing for once at their quarterbacks against Alabama. So you do have to make a pretty tough choice there. And you also got your guy, John Rice Plumlee on that slate as well, going up against a pretty, irregular and borderline mediocre Cincinnati team sitting there at 10K. So there are some tough decisions to be made on FanDuel.
That FanDuel slate is lit.
It's got so much options. Yeah. Now we do have to pay up at quarterback, but we do get your guy Ladd McConkey at 6.5. So they didn't adjust his price enough there. Obviously can lock him in. Eugene Wilson, who we mentioned for Florida at 6.4. That's a good cheap price. The UCF receivers, as always, are super cheap, so we can use them as well. And then we have on the Oklahoma State side, like Rashad Owens. We have the Leon Johnson kid that I kind of briefly talked about. He's only $5K. So if those injuries are going to happen and he's going to burn his red shirt, there's value that we can be had here because there is just a ridiculous amount of high scoring and great games here. So you had mentioned, the betting opportunity there for the Huskies. Total was like 70 something, right? Now I bet the total against Oregon, which was also 70, and of course it went way over. Do you feel like that's still a good bet here against the Trojans?
Well, so would you say, as good as Fernando Mendoza is, would you say that Michael Penix is maybe a little bit better?
Maybe a little. He might be in the Heisman contention. This might be his Heisman game. We'll see. But I think he might
So
be okay.
So if you think that Michael Penix and UW can keep up with USC, I don't see how Washington doesn't score 70 points on their own in this one. Like the only way that they don't is that like Caleb has the Notre Dame game where he just can't do anything right, and USC scores 20 points and it's just a blowout by the second quarter. And it's like, but like, I don't think Washington will punt once. I just don't. They will score on every drive. Maybe there's a field goal somewhere in the mix, but like, I feel like it's just going to be touchdown, 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 touchdown. And I don't see USC stopping them in any way, shape, or form. This is just a historically bad defense. And Penix, and just, I don't want to steal the PrizePicks thunder, but Penix has a over 3.5 touchdowns, passing touchdowns on PrizePicks. Like, that seems like the easiest thing in the world. They're like, he should do that. If he doesn't do it by the first quarter, he'll do it by the second. Like this could not be a more nuclear Michael Penix spot. If you play anyone but Michael Penix in a quarterback slot on a slate that he's on, just that's doing it wrong. He's going to score so many points.
Yeah, that 3.5 touchdown prop was on the books against Oregon, and of course he threw for 4. So that was definitely one that I was peeking at on the prop betting side as well. And the nice thing about that total, like the Huskies may score it all by themselves, but their defense isn't exactly like, they've got pros on their defense, but they're banged up all the time. And lately they've been giving up some pretty big points. Obviously the Oregon game, but Stanford, who has been kind of spotty. Their quarterback, Ashton Daniels, he threw for 367 yards on 50 attempts playing catch up, and they actually did quite well. So I do think Caleb will have some success here. Both teams scoring, somewhere in the, 35 to 40 point range at minimum, probably 50 plus each. I think that our Huskies defense is, well, it's better than USC. It's not up to par just yet, so we're going to have to outrun them score-wise, definitely. All right, so segue into PrizePicks. You had mentioned the Penix play there. I'll throw 2 that I'm really looking out in addition to that, and then we'll get your other ones here, and then we'll do some props and your stat line of the week, and then we'll head out of here. There were 2 that stuck out to me in addition to that one. Jarquez Hunter, over 81.5 rushing yards. I really like the way he's been playing. They're starting to get him more work, and he's performing. He was on a lot of breakout lists. It was kind of a slow start health-wise, but he's playing Vanderbilt. I don't know how he doesn't rush for 100 plus yards as long as he is healthy and he gets around 18 to 20 carries. It only took him 17 carries to hit 144 against Mississippi State. And you look at the past couple of games, he's been getting about 15 to 18 carries. He had the 91 yards against a tougher Ole Miss team on 15. So you're having him go against Vanderbilt and not putting his prop above 100 seems like a free one to me. So I'm going to be all over that. And then Garrett Green, my man from West Virginia, the dual threat quarterback. I think he's going to rush for a bunch of yards this weekend, over 54.5. He has just been so good this season. The game against UCF, there was some difficulties passing the ball, but he got it done on the ground. Now he's going up against that BYU rush defense that's got just pelted repeatedly. I do think Green puts up a fairly big number. So those are the two that I'm really focused in on, in addition to Penix, because I definitely am on that one too. I'm betting that as prop all over the place. What are some of your others?
So being that I like Carson Beck so much, I'm going to take him over 288 and a half passing yards. Rare for me to do a passing yards, but I like him to just kind of show out in all aspects in this one. And then Dylan Gabriel over 25 and a half fantasy points. Think that he continues the trend of running the ball in at least once and maybe more than once, and that'll help him get there. And I think we thought that was going to be a pretty explosive game all the way around. And then I'll also throw in, let's see, where was it? Eugene Wilson over 51 and a half receiving yards, peppering him with targets, and Arkansas can't really tackle anybody. So I think he gets there pretty quickly.
Love it. All right. I have a couple here for prop betting, and then we'll get your stat line. Jarquez Hunter, let's go over there on DraftKings. It's minus 115 for the over 81 and a half. I feel really good about him against Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's defense is not it, as they say. Should be able to just dominate. And then there's a bunch of other really decent ones, but I am going to be going with one that might be dangerous. Jake Brenningstool. It's 51 and a half yards at minus 115. I am taking the over there. Just the amount of targets. And I feel like the only real way that they're going to move the ball against Notre Dame is kind of just those short intermediate passes to the tight end. So I'm looking at him over 51 and a half yards. And then the Texas A&M Ole Miss game, Evan Stewart, getting him at 56 and a half yards, taking the over there at minus 115 as well. I do think we see him kind of have one of his early season games where he hits over 100 yards. Feel very, very positive. Piggybacking off your Eugene Wilson call, over 49 and a half receiving yards at minus 115 there in DraftKings. That feels rather good to me. And then we'll finish up with Ladd McConkey, 56 and a half receiving yards there as well at minus 115. That's just a really good one. I think he continues to build off of last week's performance. So I will buy into that for sure. That takes us to the player of the slate for you, the super stat line that you've been pretty damn good about. We need to start for next year. We'll assuming you want to be around next year, maybe you get tired of me. We're gonna have to start tracking that because you've been really just a badass with that stat line. Ray Davis, Mendoza, you've just been smashing. So who is that player for you this week?
So you're actually gonna get a 2-for-1 on this. You're gonna get Carson Beck for 360 passing yards, 4 touchdowns, 2 of which will go to Ladd McConkey.
Let's go. Got to get those Georgia stacks in. All right, so that is it for our Week 10 breakdown. I appreciate everybody who continues to support the show. Make sure while you're finishing up, hit the like button there. Drop a comment as well. Share our show. Next Saturday, the live before lock, 1 hour to lock show will be happening. There is going to be injury news. The last 2 pre-lock shows have been ridiculous with all this injury news. Make sure you also check out the site, ftnbets.com, FTN Daily. If you are not a sub yet, you've just been watching on the show, waiting to kind of dip your toe in the water, use that code NIGHTHOOPS for 50% off any sub for your first month. An excellent opportunity for you to see what our content is all about. Thanks to Jake for a great show as well, and we will see you guys next week.